The gentle hum of the truck echoed off the hills as it wound its way down the narrow country road. The landscape was painted with sprawling vineyards and ancient stone cottages, tucked away from the noise and chaos of the cities. This was the land where people came to slow down, to escape. And it was here, in the peaceful silence, that Kalen had found his life's calling. Kalen owned a small, almost forgotten garage near the edge of a town that few people could point out on a map. He was good with his hands, always had been. The intricate mechanics of engines and the art of bringing machines back to life was something that gave him purpose. Yet, as fulfilling as it was to repair the countless vehicles that passed through his doors, there was a deep, gnawing loneliness that lingered just beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. The kind of solitude that wasn't eased by the hum of machines or the company of passing customers. The garage was Kalen's sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in his work, shielded from the complexities of human relationships. His tools, scattered around in organized chaos, were his only companions. The local townspeople came and went, polite but distant, never venturing beyond pleasantries. And that was how Kalen liked it, until the day Kian appeared. Kian was a truck driver by trade. He had been on the road for what seemed like an eternity, moving from one city to another, his life a blur of highways and truck stops. He enjoyed the freedom his job gave him, the sense of solitude that came with being constantly on the move. But there was also a price to pay for that freedom, a lack of connection, of roots. Despite his rugged and confident appearance, Kian often found himself wondering what life would be like if he had someone to come home to, someone who understood the road he traveled. Their paths crossed one warm afternoon when Kian's truck rolled into Kalen's garage with a broken axle. He was stranded, frustrated, and in desperate need of help. Kalen, with his quiet efficiency, got to work, and within hours, Kian's truck was as good as new. It should have been just another job, just another truck passing through. But there was something about Kian that lingered with Kalen long after the truck disappeared over the horizon. For Kian, the garage became more than just a stop along the way. He found himself drawn to the quiet mechanic with the serious expression and skilled hands. On the surface, they seemed worlds apart, one man bound to his garage, the other to the open road. But underneath, they were both running from the same thing, loneliness. Weeks passed, and Kian's visits became more frequent. At first, it was just excuses, small repairs that he could have done himself, an oil change, checking the tires. But as the visits continued, it became clear that it wasn't the truck that needed fixing. Kian began to linger after the repairs were done, sitting with Kalen in the fading light of the day, sharing stories of the road, laughing at the quirks of the towns they had both passed through. Their friendship grew organically, slowly, like vines crawling up the side of an old building, until one day, they both realized it had become something more. One evening, after Kian had returned from a particularly long trip, he found Kalen working late in the garage. The air between them was charged with an unspoken tension, something that had been building for weeks. Kian's heart raced as he approached Kalen, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "You've been on my mind more than I'd like to admit," Kian finally confessed, his voice steady but soft. Kalen stopped what he was doing, the wrench slipping from his hand. He turned to face Kian, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. It was as if the world had shifted, and they were standing on the edge of something neither of them fully understood. "I didn't expect this," Kalen replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been thinking about you too." What followed was a brief but intense moment of vulnerability, a confession of feelings that neither man had been willing to admit, even to themselves. They stood there in the dim light of the garage, the tension between them finally breaking as they took the first step towards something neither of them had ever experienced before. Got it. Here's a continuation with more details and a few twists to build the tension and depth of the story. As the days turned into weeks, Kian and Kalen's bond grew deeper. They found themselves sharing more than just stories of work. They spoke about their childhoods, their hidden fears, and the dreams they had long buried beneath the weight of their isolated lives. Kian started spending entire weekends at Kalen's garage, helping him with repairs, and in return, Kalen would teach Kian more intricate details about engines and machinery. It was during these quiet moments, greasy hands working side by side, that their affection for one another became more than just a fleeting feeling. However, beneath the surface, a tension lingered. As much as they were drawn to each other, neither had fully accepted the reality of their relationship. Kian had spent his life on the road, avoiding attachments. The fear of settling down and confronting his family weighed heavily on him. Kalen, on the other hand, had spent so long in isolation that opening himself up to another person made him vulnerable in ways he had never imagined. Then came the inevitable separation. Kian had been assigned a long haul across several European countries, a journey that would keep him away for weeks. As much as he hated to leave, he didn't have a choice. His job was the only constant in his life. But this time, as he pulled away from Kalen's garage, something felt different. The usually quiet mechanic stood at the door, watching Kian leave with a look that said more than any words could. Days turned into weeks, and communication between them became scarce. Kian, who had always been comfortable with distance, now found himself aching for Kalen's presence. Every night he spent in an empty truck cab reminded him of the warmth he had left behind. He sent messages when he could, but the road was long, and his work was demanding. Kalen, on the other hand, threw himself into his work. The garage was busier than ever, but no amount of work could distract him from the growing distance between them. He knew Kian would return, but the silence in the meantime felt unbearable. What if Kian never came back? What if their connection had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in time? One late evening, after weeks of silence, Kian's truck pulled back into the garage. Kalen, who had just finished closing up for the day, was both surprised and relieved to see him. The reunion was awkward at first. Neither of them knew how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I missed this place," Kian said, his voice low. "And you?" Kalen, who had always struggled to express his emotions, simply nodded. But Kian wasn't willing to let it go this time. "I've been thinking," Kian continued, his eyes never leaving Kalen's. "About us. About what this is." Kalen set down the wrench he was holding and turned to face him fully, his heart racing. "And what did you decide?" His voice was steadier than he felt. Kian took a deep breath. "That I'm tired of running. I don't want to keep avoiding this, whatever it is between us. I don't want to be away from you." Kalen's chest tightened at the admission. It was the moment they had both been avoiding for so long, and now it was finally here. But just as Kalen was about to respond, the tension between them broke in a way neither of them expected. A knock at the garage door interrupted the moment. A young man, someone Kalen had never seen before, stood at the entrance, his expression unsure. "Kian," the man called out, stepping into the dimly lit garage. Kian's face paled. "Nate, what are you doing here?" His voice was filled with surprise and an edge of panic. Kalen looked between the two men, confusion and unease settling in his chest. "Who is this?" he asked quietly, his heart sinking. Nate, who looked equally uncomfortable, shifted his gaze from Kian to Kalen. I'm his boyfriend." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Kalen felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind struggled to process what Nate had just said. Kian had never mentioned another man, never given any indication that he was seeing someone else. And yet, here he was, standing in Kalen's garage, with a stranger claiming to be his boyfriend. "I can explain," Kian began, stepping forward, but Kalen raised a hand to stop him. "No," Kalen said, his voice cold and distant. "You don't have to explain anything. I think I understand perfectly." The silence between them was deafening. Nate, sensing the tension, looked at Kian, his expression a mixture of hurt and confusion. "You didn't tell me you were involved with someone else," Nate said quietly, his voice trembling. Kian ran a hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "It's not like that," he insisted. "Nate, we were." But the words didn't come. Kian was trapped between two worlds, two men, and he didn't know how to untangle the mess he had created. Without another word, Kalen turned and walked away, disappearing into the back of the garage. His heart felt heavy, and the walls that he had carefully built around himself began to rise again, thicker and taller than before. Kian stood there, his world unraveling before his eyes. He had wanted to come clean, to tell Kalen the truth, but he hadn't expected it to happen like this. Now, he was faced with the possibility of losing both men, one he had shared a past with, and one he had started to build a future with. In the days that followed, the silence between Kalen and Kian was more than just a lack of communication, it was a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. Kian tried reaching out, sending messages, calling, but Kalen didn't respond. He was hurt, betrayed, and confused. Kian's relationship with Nate was complicated. They had been together for years, but it had never been perfect. They were both men who found comfort in routine, but love had long faded into the background. Kian had planned to end things with Nate, but when the road had taken him away from Kalen, he found himself falling back into old patterns, too afraid to make the leap into something new and unknown. Now, Kian was faced with the reality of his choices. He couldn't continue living two lives, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing Kalen. But first, he had to confront his past with Nate. When Kian finally sat down with Nate, the conversation was raw and painful. Nate, though hurt by the betrayal, understood that their relationship had been unraveling for a long time. They parted ways amicably, but the weight of guilt lingered in Kian's heart. With Nate out of his life, Kian returned to Kalen's garage, determined to make things right. But winning back Kalen's trust wouldn't be easy. Kalen had been hurt before, and the betrayal had only reinforced his fears of opening up to someone again. "I don't know if I can trust you," Kalen said when Kian finally confronted him. "I know," Kian replied, his voice soft but firm. "But I'm not giving up on us. I made mistakes, big ones, but what I feel for you is real." Kalen's eyes softened, but the hurt was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. "How do I know you won't leave again? That you won't just disappear when things get hard?" Kian took a step closer, his eyes locked on Kalen's. "Because this time, I'm not running." The days following Kian's confession were filled with silence, but not the peaceful kind that Kalen had once cherished. It was the heavy, oppressive silence that clung to every corner of the garage and suffocated him with every breath. Kalen found solace in his work, burying himself in repairs, but the emptiness in his heart was harder to ignore. Kian, on the other hand, was relentless in his pursuit of redemption. Every day, he showed up at the garage, even when there was no work to be done. He'd bring coffee in the mornings, offer to help with repairs, and spend long hours sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for Kalen to talk to him. Kian was determined to prove that he was no longer the man who would run away when things got hard. But Kalen's walls were thick, built from years of isolation and fear. It wasn't just Kian's betrayal that hurt him, it was the realization that he had let himself become vulnerable, only to be reminded of why he had avoided relationships in the first place. The idea of opening himself up again, to Kian or anyone else, terrified him. One rainy afternoon, after hours of working in near silence, Kalen finally broke the tension. "Why didn't you tell me about Nate?" Kalen's voice was low, almost drowned out by the sound of rain on the roof. Kian looked up from where he had been sitting, surprised that Kalen was finally speaking to him. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "Nate and we've been together for years, but it wasn't like what we have. I didn't expect to feel this way about you." Kalen didn't respond right away, his hands still working on the engine in front of him. "And now, is he still in the picture?" "No," Kian said firmly. "I ended it. I should have done it a long time ago, but I was too afraid of being alone. I was too comfortable in something that wasn't right for me. And how do I know you're not just looking for the next thing to run to?" Kalen's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Kian stood up, crossing the garage to where Kalen stood. He placed a hand on the mechanic's shoulder, his touch gentle but steady. "Because I'm not running anymore. I don't want anything or anyone else. I want you." Kalen's heart raced, his mind a whirl of emotions. He wanted to believe Kian, but the fear of being hurt again loomed large. For a moment, he considered pushing Kian away again, but something inside him stopped. Maybe it was the sincerity in Kian's eyes, or maybe it was the realization that he was tired of being alone too. "I need time," Kalen finally said, his voice softer now. Kian nodded, relief washing over him. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As the weeks passed, the tension between Kalen and Kian began to ease, though the distance between them remained. They returned to their routine, working on trucks together, sharing meals, but the easy friendship they once had was replaced with a more cautious, tentative connection. Kian, true to his word, gave Kalen the space he needed. He didn't push for more than Kalen was willing to give, and slowly, Kalen began to trust him again. It wasn't an easy process, and there were days when the weight of their past mistakes threatened to pull them apart again. But every time Kalen started to retreat into himself, Kian was there, patient and steady, reminding him that he wasn't alone. One evening, after a particularly long day at the garage, they sat outside watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, the air cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Kian asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Kalen glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever think about getting out of this town? Starting fresh somewhere new?" Kalen frowned, unsure of where this was coming from. "Not really. The garage is my life. I wouldn't know what to do anywhere else." Kian nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out at the horizon. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately. About what it would be like to settle down somewhere quiet, just the two of us." Kalen's heart skipped a beat at the implication of Kian's words. "You're talking about us, together." Kian turned to face him, his expression serious. "Yeah, I am. I know we still have a lot to figure out, and I know I've hurt you, but I want a life with you, Kalen. I want more than just passing through town every few weeks. I want to be with you, really be with you." Kalen didn't know how to respond. The idea of leaving the life he had built, the garage that had been his sanctuary for so many years, was terrifying. But the thought of a future with Kian, of not having to say goodbye every time Kian left on the road, was equally tempting. "I don't know if I can do that," Kalen said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "You don't have to decide right now," Kian said quickly. I wanted you to know where my head's at. I'm ready to build a life with you, if that's what you want." Kalen didn't respond, but the idea lingered in his mind long after the sun had set and they had gone inside. Just as Kalen was beginning to come to terms with the possibility of a future with Kian, another obstacle arose: his family. Kalen had never been particularly close to his family, but when they learned about his relationship with Kian, the reaction was swift and harsh. His parents, who lived in a nearby town, were conservative and deeply set in their ways. They had always expected Kalen to settle down with a nice woman, start a family, and carry on the family name. The idea of him being with another man was something they could not accept. The first time Kalen told his parents about Kian, it didn't go well. "This isn't who you are," his mother had said, her voice filled with disappointment. "You're confused. This man is just a phase." His father had been even harsher, refusing to even acknowledge the possibility of Kalen being in a relationship with another man. "I didn't raise you to live like this," he had said, his voice cold. "If you continue down this path, don't expect to be welcome in this family." Kalen had left their house that day feeling shattered, unsure of how to navigate the new chasm that had opened between him and the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. Kian, who had faced similar opposition from his own family, tried to be there for Kalen, but the hurt ran deep. The rejection from his parents cut deeper than any betrayal Kian could have inflicted. "Maybe they'll come around," Kian offered one evening, as they sat together in the garage. "It took my family a long time, but they eventually accepted me." Kalen shook his head. "You don't know my parents. They won't change. People can surprise you," Kian said gently. "You just have to give them time." But time wasn't something Kalen felt he had. The pressure from his family weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he began to question whether he and Kian could really have a future together. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult Kalen had ever experienced. His parents refused to speak to him, and every attempt he made to reach out was met with silence. He tried to throw himself into his work, but even the steady rhythm of repairing engines couldn't distract him from the growing emptiness inside. Kian, sensing the weight of Kalen's pain, remained by his side. He didn't push Kalen to talk about it, but he was always there, ready to listen, to offer comfort when needed. Yet, despite Kian's unwavering presence, Kalen found himself retreating further into himself. The rejection from his family had reopened old wounds, wounds that he had never fully healed from. One evening, as they sat together in the garage after another long day of work, Kalen finally let the walls he had been building crack. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Kalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kian looked up from the engine he had been working on, his brow furrowed in concern. "Do what?" "This," Kalen gestured vaguely around him. "Us. My family won't ever accept it. I don't know how to be with you when everything in my life is falling apart." Kian felt his heart drop. "Kalen, I know this is hard, but you don't have to choose between me and your family. They'll come around. They just need time. Kalen shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut Kian to the core. You don't know them like I do. They're never going to change. And I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. Kian stood up, crossing the small space between them in an instant. He placed a hand on Kalen's arm, his touch gentle but firm. I'm not going to let you go that easily. We've come too far to just give up now. Kalen's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping under the weight of everything he had been carrying. I just don't know if I'm strong enough. Kian's voice softened, but there was a determination in his eyes that Kalen had never seen before. You're stronger than you think. We'll get through this. Together. For a long moment, Kalen said nothing, the silence between them heavy with the unspoken fear and doubt that had been building for weeks. But in Kian's eyes, he saw something that gave him hope, a belief in their love, in their ability to face whatever challenges came their way. Just as things were beginning to settle between them, life threw another curveball. One morning, while Kian was out on a delivery run, Kalen received a phone call that would change everything. His father had suffered a heart attack and was in critical condition. The news hit him like a freight train. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the anger and the distance, Kalen still loved his father. The thought of losing him without ever making things right was too much to bear. Without hesitation, Kalen rushed to the hospital. When he arrived, his mother was there, her face pale and drawn with worry. She barely looked at him as he approached, the tension between them still thick, even in the midst of the crisis. How is he? Kalen asked, his voice shaky. They're doing everything they can, his mother replied, her tone clipped. But it doesn't look good. The hours that followed were a blur. Kalen sat by his father's bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, each breath labored and strained. He wanted to speak to him, to tell him how much he regretted the distance that had grown between them, but the words wouldn't come. Later that night, as the machines in his father's hospital room beeped softly in the background, Kalen's mother finally broke the silence between them. This isn't what he wanted for you, she said, her voice trembling. He wanted you to have a normal life, to be happy. Kalen's heart twisted at her words. I am happy, Mom. Or at least, I was. But you and Dad couldn't accept that. His mother turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored his own. We just wanted what was best for you. We didn't understand this. Kalen's throat tightened, the weight of their past arguments pressing down on him. I didn't ask you to understand. I just wanted you to love me anyway. Tears welled in his mother's eyes, and for the first time, Kalen saw the vulnerability in her, the fear of losing her son. I do love you, Kalen. I always have. But this has been hard for us to accept. I know it has, Kalen said, his voice softening. But this is who I am. I can't change that. His mother wiped at her eyes, her expression conflicted. I don't want to lose you too. The words hung between them, fragile and tentative. It was the closest thing to an olive branch that Kalen had received from his mother in months, and while it wasn't the full acceptance he longed for, it was a start. The next few days were some of the most difficult Kalen had ever faced. His father's condition remained critical, and Kalen spent every waking moment at the hospital, hoping for a miracle that never seemed to come. Kian, sensing that Kalen needed space to navigate this family crisis, kept his distance but remained a constant source of support. He called every day, offering words of comfort and strength, even when Kalen couldn't find the words to respond. Finally, after days of waiting and hoping, Kalen's father began to show signs of improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kalen allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. During this time, Kalen's relationship with his mother began to mend, slowly but surely. The conversations they had at the hospital, though painful, began to chip away at the wall that had grown between them. She wasn't fully accepting of his relationship with Kian, but she was trying, and that was more than Kalen had dared hope for. One evening, as they sat together in the hospital waiting room, his mother surprised him with a question. Is he good to you? Kian. Kalen looked up, startled by the question. He is, he said softly. He's been there for me when no one else has. I don't know what I'd do without him. His mother nodded slowly, as if weighing the words carefully. Maybe we should meet him. Kalen's heart skipped a beat at her words. It wasn't a declaration of acceptance, but it was a step toward healing, toward a future where he didn't have to choose between the man he loved and the family he had always longed to reconnect with. A week later, Kian stood nervously outside Kaylin's family home, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the first time he was going to meet Kaylin's parents, and despite everything Kaylin had told him, he wasn't sure what to expect. The tension between them had been palpable for months, and Kian wasn't sure if this meeting would be the first step toward healing or another roadblock in their already complicated relationship. Kaylin opened the door, greeting him with a small, reassuring smile. "You ready?" Kian took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The dinner was tense at first, the conversation stilted and awkward. Kaylin's mother, while polite, still struggled with the reality of her son's relationship. But as the evening wore on, the ice began to thaw. Kian spoke openly about his life, his work, and his feelings for Kaylin, and slowly, Kaylin's mother began to see him not as an outsider, but as someone who genuinely cared for her son. By the end of the night, there was still much left unsaid, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was no longer suffocating, and for the first time, Kaylin felt a glimmer of hope that his family might one day accept Kian as part of their lives. As they left the house that night, Kaylin turned to Kian with a smile. "I think that went well." Kian chuckled softly, relieved. "I think it did too." They walked hand in hand through the quiet streets, the weight of the past months slowly lifting from their shoulders. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a new chapter in their story, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future they could build together. Kaylin and Kian's relationship continued to strengthen in the weeks that followed the dinner with Kaylin's family. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but they were moving forward. Kaylin's mother had begun to soften, even inviting Kian over for dinner a few more times, though his father remained distant. Still, there was progress, and for the first time in a long while, Kaylin felt like he could breathe again. The garage, which had always been Kaylin's sanctuary, became a place where they could both escape. They worked side by side, sharing comfortable silences and easy laughter. Kian's time on the road became less frequent as he took on more local jobs, allowing him to stay close to Kaylin and spend more time building the life they had talked about. But as the calm settled over their lives, a new storm was brewing, one that neither of them saw coming. It started with a phone call, one that Kian never expected to receive. He was in the middle of a delivery run when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he wouldn't have answered, but something about the timing felt off. He picked up the call, and the voice on the other end froze him in his tracks. "Is this Kian Donovan?" the voice asked, clipped and professional. "Yes, who's this?" Kian replied, his brow furrowing. "This is Detective Arnaud from the Paris Police Department. We need to ask you a few questions regarding a case you were involved in 2 years ago." Kian's heart dropped. He hadn't thought about that part of his life in years, not since he'd left Paris and the mess he had been entangled in. Before meeting Kaylin, before Nate, Kian had been involved with a man named Julian, a relationship that had ended in disaster. Julian had been involved in illegal activities that Kian hadn't fully understood until it was too late. He had walked away from that life, but it seemed like the past wasn't willing to let him go. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kian lied, his voice tight. "I think you do," the detective replied calmly. "We have evidence that ties you to Julian Mercier's operation, and we need you to come in for questioning." Kian's mind raced. He had never been directly involved in Julian's schemes, but he had been close enough to know the consequences of getting involved with the police. If this information got out, if Kaylin or his family found out, everything they had built could fall apart. "I'll be there," Kian said finally, his heart pounding in his chest. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kian couldn't focus on his work, couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with the detective. He had to keep this from Kaylin. He couldn't let this ruin everything they had fought so hard to build. That evening, when Kian returned to the garage, Kaylin immediately sensed that something was off. Kian was quieter than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. But when Kaylin asked him about it, Kian brushed it off, claiming he was just tired from the long drive. Kaylin didn't push, but the unease lingered. He had learned to read Kian over the months they had been together, and he knew when something was weighing on him. Still, he trusted Kian, and if Kian said he was fine, Kaylin would take him at his word. But the lie gnawed at Kian, growing heavier with each passing day. He kept his meetings with the police a secret, traveling to Paris when Kalen thought he was on deliveries. The investigation was dragging on, and while Kian maintained his innocence, the detectives weren't letting up. They needed more information about Julian's operation, and they believed Kian had the answers. The weight of the secret began to affect Kian in ways he hadn't anticipated. He became distant, withdrawn, and even when he was with Kalen, his mind was elsewhere. Kalen, noticing the change, tried to talk to him, but Kian brushed him off time and time again. One evening, after weeks of tension, Kalen finally confronted him. "Kian, what's going on?" Kalen's voice was laced with concern as they sat together in the garage, the hum of the machinery in the background. "You've been acting strange for weeks now, and I can't keep pretending that everything's fine." Kian's chest tightened. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready to tell Kalen the truth, to risk losing him over something from his past. "I'm fine," Kian said, his voice strained. "It's just work." Kalen's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I know you, Kian. Something's wrong, and I need you to tell me what it is." Kian's hands clenched into fists, the pressure of the secret threatening to break him. He wanted to tell Kalen the truth, but the fear of losing him, of losing the life they had built, kept him silent. "It's nothing, Kalen. Just drop it, okay?" But Kalen didn't drop it. His frustration boiled over, and before he could stop himself, the words came rushing out. "You can't keep shutting me out like this. I've been here for you through everything, but you won't even let me in when something's clearly wrong." Kian stood up abruptly, his face contorted with anger and fear. "You don't understand, Kalen. You don't know what it's like to have your past come back to haunt you. I'm trying to protect you." Kalen's expression shifted, confusion and hurt flashing across his face. "Protect me from what?" Kian realized his mistake too late. The words had slipped out, and now there was no turning back. The truth was hanging in the air, and Kalen wasn't going to let it go. "Kian, what aren't you telling me?" Kalen's voice was soft now, the anger replaced with concern. Kian sank back into his chair, his hands running through his hair. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "Before I met you, I was involved with someone dangerous. His name was Julian, and he was involved in some illegal stuff. I didn't know the full extent of it at the time, but now the police are looking into it, and they think I know more than I do." Kalen stared at him, his mind reeling from the confession. "And you didn't think to tell me this before. You've been lying to me for weeks." "I didn't want to drag you into it," Kian said desperately. "I didn't want to risk losing you." Kalen stood up, pacing the garage, his mind racing. "So what happens now? Are you in trouble?" "I don't know," Kian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been talking to the police, trying to clear my name, but it's complicated. I didn't want to worry you." Kalen stopped pacing and turned to face him, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You should have told me. We could have figured it out together." Kian looked up at him, regret etched into every line of his face. "I'm sorry. I was just scared." Kalen sighed, the weight of Kian's confession pressing down on him. He wanted to be angry, wanted to lash out, but all he felt was exhaustion. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice soft. "But no more lies. If we're going to get through this, we need to do it together." Kian nodded, the relief of finally telling the truth washing over him. "I promise, no more lies." In the days that followed, Kian and Kalen worked together to navigate the legal mess that Kian had found himself in. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the stress threatened to tear them apart again. But this time, they faced it together, side by side. Kian continued to cooperate with the police, providing what little information he had about Julian and his operation. The investigation dragged on, but with Kalen's support, Kian was able to stay grounded. Kalen, despite his initial anger, remained a pillar of strength for Kian. He had his own fears that Kian's past might come back to destroy the life they had built, but he refused to let those fears dictate their future. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation finally came to a close. Kian was cleared of any wrongdoing, and while the shadow of his past would always linger, it no longer held power over him. Together, they moved forward, stronger than ever. With the investigation behind them, Kalen and Kian found a new sense of peace in their relationship. The storm that had threatened to tear them apart had passed, but the scars it left behind were a reminder of how fragile life could be. They had made it through the worst, and now, it was time to focus on building their future. One evening, as they sat outside the garage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Kalen spoke up, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes focused on the distant hills. "About what you said, about starting fresh somewhere new." Kian turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden shift in the conversation. "You mean leaving this place?" Kalen nodded. "Yeah, I've spent my whole life here, in this garage, in this town. And I love it, I do, but maybe it's time for something different." Kian's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying you want to move with me?" Kalen smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yeah, I think I am." The idea of leaving the only home he had ever known was terrifying, but the thought of starting a new chapter with Kian, away from the shadows of their past, was even more enticing. They had been through so much, and now, they deserved a chance to build something new, together. Kian reached over, taking Kalen's hand in his. "Where do you want to go?" Kalen shrugged, the weight of the decision not lost on him. "I don't know. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere where we can just be ourselves." They spent the rest of the evening dreaming of their future, talking about the possibilities of where they could go, what kind of life they could build together. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Just as they were beginning to make plans for their new life, an unexpected offer came their way, one that would throw all of their carefully laid plans into question. Kian had been approached by a major logistics company with an offer that was hard to refuse. The job would pay significantly more than his current work as a freelance truck driver, and it would offer stability, something he had never had before. But there was a catch. The job was based in Paris, the city where all of Kian's troubles with Julian had begun. When Kian told Kalen about the offer, his excitement was tempered by the look of concern on Kalen's face. "Paris?" Kalen asked, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure that's a good idea? After everything that happened there?" Kian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I'm not thrilled about going back either, but it's a good opportunity. It could give us the kind of life we've been talking about." Kalen was silent for a moment, weighing the decision in his mind. On one hand, the offer was too good to ignore. It would provide them with financial security and the chance to start fresh. But on the other hand, Paris held too many ghosts from Kian's past, ghosts that could easily come back to haunt them. "I don't know, Kian," Kalen said finally, his voice laced with uncertainty. "What if it brings all that trouble back? What if Julian finds out you're back?" Kian frowned, the thought sending a chill down his spine. "I thought about that too, but Julian's operation is over. He's not a threat anymore." "Are you sure?" Kalen pressed, his concern growing. "I just don't want to walk into another nightmare." Kian looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and doubt. "I don't know if I'm sure. But this job, it's a chance for us to really build something. I want to be with you, and I want to provide for us." Kalen's heart softened at Kian's words. He knew that Kian wasn't just thinking about himself, he was thinking about their future, about the life they could have together. But the thought of returning to the city that had nearly destroyed them was a risk Kalen wasn't sure he was willing to take. "I need some time to think about it," Kalen said quietly. Kian nodded, understanding the weight of the decision they were facing. "Take all the time you need." Just as Kalen was grappling with the decision of whether or not to move to Paris, another unexpected event threw their lives into chaos. Kalen's father, who had been recovering from his heart attack, suddenly took a turn for the worse. The news came as a shock, and Kalen found himself rushing to the hospital once again, unsure of what awaited him. When he arrived, his mother was already there, her face pale and drawn with worry. She barely looked at him as he entered the room, but the tension between them had softened since their last confrontation. "The doctors aren't sure what's going on," his mother said, her voice trembling. "They're running more tests, but it doesn't look good." Kalen's heart sank. He had hoped that his father's condition was improving, but now it seemed like the fragile peace they had found was crumbling once again. As the hours dragged on, Kalen found himself sitting by his father's bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, each breath labored and strained. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, regret. "I'm sorry," Kalen whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. I'm sorry for everything. His father didn't respond, didn't stir. The room was filled with an eerie silence, the only sound the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Kalen's mother sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. He was proud of you, you know, she said softly. Even if he never said it. Kalen's heart twisted at her words. I don't know if I believe that. His mother looked up, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored his own. It's true. He may not have understood your choices, but he always respected your strength. He just didn't know how to show it. The words hung between them, fragile and tentative, but they were a step toward healing, a step toward forgiveness. Kalen's father eventually stabilized, but his condition remained precarious. The uncertainty of his father's health weighed heavily on Kalen, adding another layer of complexity to the decision he and Kian were facing. The offer to move to Paris still loomed large in their lives, but now, with his father's health in question, Kalen found himself torn between staying close to his family and taking the leap to start a new life with Kian. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Kalen and Kian sat together in their small apartment, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. I don't know what to do, Kalen admitted, his voice tired and strained. I don't want to leave my family, but I don't want to lose you either. Kian reached over, taking Kalen's hand in his. You won't lose me. No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. Kalen looked at him, his heart aching with the weight of the choice he had to make. I don't know how to choose. Kian was silent for a moment, his eyes filled with empathy. Maybe you don't have to. Kalen frowned, confused by Kian's words. What do you mean? Kian smiled softly, his eyes meeting Kalen's with a look of understanding. We don't have to go to Paris right away. Maybe we can wait. Stay here for a while longer, until things with your family settle down. Kalen felt a wave of relief wash over him. You'd be okay with that? Kian nodded. Of course. You're more important to me than any job, any city. We'll figure it out, together. Kalen smiled, the weight of the decision lifting from his shoulders. They had been through so much together, and now, they were stronger for it. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, with love and trust guiding them. With the decision to stay in their small town for a while longer, Kalen and Kian found a new sense of peace in their relationship. They continued to build their life together, taking things one day at a time. The challenges they had faced, the secrets, the lies, the fear, had brought them closer, and now, they were ready to face whatever came next. Kalen's father's condition remained stable, but fragile, and Kalen spent as much time with his family as he could. His relationship with his mother continued to improve, and while his father never fully accepted Kalen's relationship with Kian, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a truce of sorts. As the months passed, Kian's job offer remained on the table, but for now, they were content to stay where they were. The garage, which had once been Kalen's sanctuary, had now become their shared space, a symbol of the life they were building together. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: they were ready to face it, together.